we're going to go through some quick things, and I'm going to get my cheat sheet. Just wait. We're going to go through some quick things on nutrition. Where do you want me?
Just stay behind the table.
Anywhere behind the table?
Anywhere, that's okay.
All right, good. So when we go through this, as you think about managing feedlot cattle and you're going through, it's a little different mindset than maybe what we're used to, even if we've backgrounded cattle before. Because we're looking at a transition period. Okay, you're thinking about taking this wean calf. Maybe these calves are coming straight to you off of the cow. Maybe they've been in a backgrounding program like what these cattle have, because they're coming in 700-800 pounds. And so they've probably gone through some type of backgrounding program before they come in. So there's a little bit of difference, but we're transitioning these cattle from a predominantly forage-based diet with maybe some milk if they were on the cow, to a strictly grain-based diet, and that has some implications as we go through the finishing program or the finishing period. So with respect to this transition period and transitional management, there are several things that we want to keep in the back of our minds as we think about the calf itself. Okay? And it's the same thing that Dr. Arnold will talk to you about with regards to risk categorization. Are they low risk or are they high risk? Okay, so examples of those might be some 275 to 300 pound calves coming out of Florida to Kentucky. Would you categorize them as low or high risk? Okay, probably pretty high risk. Long haul, likely commingled, and pretty lightweight. Okay, very different than the cattle that we're dealing with here that are heavier weight, came from the region, not a very long haul, and a little bit heavier. And we look at the feedlot placement data, and we know from the closeout data that the lighter the weights that cattle go into the feed yard and on feed, the higher the health risk, the higher the death loss. And so heavier cattle tend to have been exposed to things a little bit more, been around the block a time or two, if you will, have a much lower incidence of health in general. So there are a lot of factors that we don't know a lot of times with the background of these calves. And so sometimes we have to, if we don't get paperwork with them, i.e. either a preconditioned calf like CPH 45, we have to assume that we're starting back from scratch. Okay? And that's where we're going to start off. If you think about these calves and you think about the programs that they've been in and or the management of them, think about the Holsteins. We've talked a little bit, we've got a couple Holsteins. You think a Holstein calf has ever been exposed to grain? Yeah, because one of the general things is to wean them in the conventional dairy steer production is about 6 to 8 weeks of age and eating 4 pounds of calf starter. So they kind of know the routine of eating. Versus a 400-pound calf coming straight off of mama that's probably never seen any grain at all. So you have to keep those factors in the back of your mind, especially even when we think about creep feeding, calves that have been preconditioned, that have been trained to eat out of a feed bunk. And do you know what kind of mix that you have up here? We don't. We might have 2 or 3 in the mix that have been creep fed or have been fed couple pounds of grain for the last 200 days from weaning till now, or 100 days from weaning to now. They may know how to eat, and we may have some that have never seen it. And so that can pose a little bit of a management challenge. Because who's going to eat the most? The ones that know what it is not really going to be timid to go to the feed bunk and eat, and they're going to go in and maybe get a little bit more of their share. Okay? One of the biggest challenges that we find when we work with folks is overlooking the importance of water. I was just on a farm visit the other day, and very clear that get out there, calves, a couple hundred, well, I guess he does a couple hundred head a year. There's about 100, 125 in the barn right now. Been in there about 4 weeks, and they just weren't doing very well. And they looked healthy, they weren't coughing, they were chewing their cud, but they just looked rough. So we did some troubleshooting things. We found out a little bit of issues with the ration, but that wasn't enough to say, why do these calves look so rough? So went and looked at the water, and the water was really fouled. And so cleaned the water out, and notable difference within 24 hours. Sometimes it takes a little bit of another set of eyes, if you will, just to look at those things. But the critical thing to take home is you have a calf that has come maybe through the market channels, has come onto your farm, and you want to make sure that they have access to water. 80 to 85% water in the rumen for those bugs to do their job. And so research that was done back in the late 60s at UK and also at Australia shows that as we begin to limit water intake, we begin to limit feed intake. And as you reduce the amount of feed they consume, what do you think happens to performance? It goes down and goes down dramatically. So we want to make sure we've got good water. Calves are probably, if they've been shipped for any length of time, they're going to be somewhat dehydrated, and we want to get them hydrated and get that water back into them as quick as we possibly can. Okay? What's wrong with this dude? Okay? This is the train wreck ready to happen, right? What's that tell you? What is that little piece residue of? Can anybody see it? That's a back tag. Okay? So what does that mean? He's not farmed from the farm, right? He's gone through somebody's auction facility. You can't see it very good here, but he's got a pretty good set hanging down there. So is that going to add any additional stress? And then Dr. Arnold, why is he hanging his head? He doesn't feel good. He's already not feeling good. He hasn't been castrated yet, and he hasn't been there just too long because we still got the back tag on him. He hasn't rubbed that off yet. So this is the train wreck ready to start him. How do you avoid it? And that's where Dr. Arnold's, the health component will come in. But the nutrition is just as important. And the small things, getting water to them right away, getting the mineral program to them right away, are often what are overlooked to prevent this. Okay? Think about it from this perspective. If we have about a 3 to 4 month old calf, about half of the nutrients that that calf needs at that point is coming from mom's milk. The other half is coming from whatever forage or feeds are available to the calf. So as it gets older, and we typically wean calves at 6 to 7 months, right? As that calf gets older, what happens to the lactation curve of the cow? Well, how many pounds of milk is she milking at 3 to 4 months, for example, versus 6 to 7 months? Is it higher or lower? Yeah, her lactation curve is going down, and so at 6 to 7 months, that calf is getting predominantly most of its nutrients from the forage base that it's exposed to or other feedstuffs if there's maybe some creep feed out there. But forage is the main thing, and now we're going to bring them in to the feedlot, and we're going to transition them to a grain-based diet. And we need to do that over a period of time because the bacterial population that are in the rumen are predominantly going to be forage, or they're going to prefer to ferment forages. They're not going to be the ones that are there looking to ferment starch, for example. And so we want to introduce starch into the ration to get those bugs used to seeing it, and also then to begin growing the population of bugs that are predominantly starch fermenters. Okay, so that's that transition of the ration, and why we don't want to go in. We got 700-pound calves here that will eat 2.5 to 3% of their body weight, so that's, 18 to 22 pounds of feed. We don't want to go in there. They came in today, they look good. Tomorrow we're going to get them a bucket of feed a head, right? Give them almost 25 pounds a head and let them roll. No, you don't want to do that. That's too much grain at one point in time. You've got to get that bug population transitioned so you don't run into problems. Calves that have been creep fed, what's the likelihood that they're going to know how to eat when they come into the lot? Pretty good. Okay, that's a good way to transition cattle, especially if you're going to retain ownership for a period of time, even if you're backgrounding. A little bit of creep feed, 45 to 90 days before you wean will help that weaning transition as well. The mineral program is often, you're not going to know if it was straight white salt, red salt, or a good complete mineral package. And a good mineral package, if the feeders are designed where calves can get easy access to it, a 500-pound calf will eat 3 to 4 ounces a head a day, just like the mama cow will. Okay, so they will eat it. Now, whether or not they had access to it is the question. Also, our goal is to get these calves to return to somewhat of normal being, if you will. Get over the stress, get back up on their feed, get all the pecking order situated, right? Because they likely have been commingled with other calves, and we want to get all that sorted down in the first few days and get these calves back to normal. Because the quicker they get back to normal, the quicker you're going to start seeing these calves perform. We want good quality, grassy, leafy hay. You don't want hay that's going to be cut within the next week, okay? Because it's already past its prime and the quality is going down. Second cutting grass hay is kind of ideal because it's all leaf. Okay, we want to avoid that second, third, fourth cutting alfalfa because it's really good stuff, right? But it's too much of a good thing and it can cause them to get diarrhea, and now you just cause them to get a little bit more dehydrated. So good grass, leafy hay. Don't get that bale that's so daggone tight that, you know, the cow rips her teeth out trying to get it out of the bale. Okay? You want it easy for them to eat. You want to promote intake. We like tight bales, don't we? They're easy to stack, et cetera, but you want to stimulate intake on these calves, and you want to be able to get it out. Believe it or not, it was about a year and a half ago, we were on a farm, and that was the case. The bales were so daggone tight, the cattle couldn't pull the hay out of it. Okay, so don't take it to the extreme. During this transition period from forage to grain, there's going to be some challenges to overcome. And when we begin introducing grain to a forage-based diet, we typically refer to things as either a positive or a negative associative effect. And what that means is that if I have a group of cattle and they don't get any supplement, they're going to consume X amount of forage. If I come in and supplement those cattle with a little bit of supplement, it will either increase, decrease, or have no impact on that forage intake. And what do we want? Do we want to exchange the supplement for forage intake? Do we want to have no effect on it and the supplement's just additional nutrients? Or do we want to stimulate a little bit more forage intake as we bring in that grain? Okay, so it depends on the situation a little bit, but we want to avoid the negative associative effects. And that's where too much starch at a given time comes into play, because it causes the pH in the rumen to go down. The bugs don't like that because your fiber degrading bugs are sensitive to that, and so they won't work very efficiently for you, and so you'll begin to see a decrease in fiber digestion. And so then if they're not working at their potential, intake goes down, and so you're going to lose performance. A classic response where we get a forage increase, a positive effect, is when we have a protein deficiency. Not enough protein in the rumen for the bugs to do their thing, and we go in and give a little supplemental protein, and now they're a little more efficient. They digest the forage quicker, and their intake goes up. And most of what we're doing in the receiving rations is the goal is to try and have no or a positive effect. We really don't want to have much of a negative effect. You think about putting together these receiving rations. Talk past all the traffic. We think about putting together these receiving rations. It's important to understand that transition, okay? And then you have to think about, well, what feeds also have higher rates of fermentation and are at a higher risk to causing a digestive upset like acidosis. And so we know that rolled wheat or cracked wheat, think about that wheat kernel. If you were to break it between your, a couple rocks or between your fingers and roll it in your hand, it's pretty floury, right? The starch protein matrix makes that to where it's rapidly fermentable in the rumen. Compared to corn, if you were to grind up that corn the same way, it's a lot more coarse, isn't it? It's more gritty, that flour. And so it has a slower rate of fermentation. And then you get all the way down into sorghum and down into oats, and there's a very complex starch protein matrix that makes them a lot less, it ferments a lot slower than wheat and corn and gives you a little bit more protection. So we want to try and limit that risk of acidosis in these transition periods because we don't want the calves to get an upset stomach and go off of feed. Because what's the whole purpose? What are we really trying to do? Get them back to normal and get them eating. Healthy calves eat. Calves that eat don't get sick. Okay, so it's important. And you'll see in the rations, in some of the rations, even the finishing rations that we're using at places, we're putting some whole oats in there. We're using a mixture of cracked corn and whole shell corn. Why are we doing that? Because we're wanting to spread that fermentation rate out and not have that pH drop down so fast in the rumen. So we're going to have more of a slow, gradual decline. And it gives us a little bit of safety margin in there if a calf overeats a little bit too much today, right? Because if I've got a group of 10 or a group of 300 head in a pen, and they're all eating out of a bunk, can I control, hey, number 202, you're going to eat your 20 pounds today and that's it? Okay, so we try and put the rations together to minimize that risk. In the transition rations, the receiving rations, you'll see a lot of these feeds. In your stress rations, you'll see a lot of these feedstuffs. Soybeans whole, wheat mids, corn gluten feed. They're low starch, high protein, and a highly digestible fiber. They work well in these receiving rations. We have a forage-based, grass-based calf, and now I'm supplementing them with a highly digestible fiber feed stuff that gives them much more energy. It's the same population of bugs, so I want to have some of that in there, and then I begin introducing a little bit of starch. Okay? Don't worry, we just have some cows that are trying to move back to their calves. There are different things. The Morgan County location, because of labor constraints, are going to push these cattle onto a self-feeder. Okay, and so in that, we want to have some protective mechanism. And how are we going to do that? We either have to limit how much the cattle eat, because it's like telling, a kid that, here's a whole big bar of candy, but just don't eat too much that you get sick. Okay, my 9-year-old, yeah, he would push the limit on that, because he has. And then he gets sick and he wonders why. And well, we told you so, right? But are cattle going to do that? No. So you have to take it from a management standpoint and either limit how much they eat or dilute the amount of starch in the ration, right? And so we'll use some of these other feedstuffs that give us some protection that have little starch, allow us to get some roughage in there, and or dilute down that starch component. So cottonseed hulls. We're using cottonseed hulls in this ration with some oats, and we're using cottonseed hulls and oats in the other ration at West Liberty. Peanut hulls can be used. They're very low in energy, very low in digestibility, and they're a true diluter just like rice hulls would be. But there's a way in a self-feeder that's a little bit different to try and lower that risk to acidosis without using a limiter. Okay? Bunk management's critical in the receiving program. You don't want a lot of competition at the feed bunk. You don't want calves that are stressed out, trying to get their pecking order, trying to figure out where the water is, trying to establish this new pen dynamics, to be stressed out when they want to go eat. You want low competition. And so as we think about that, there are some things that we want to keep in the back of our mind. How are we going to deliver the feed? Self-feeders, they're all right once we get cattle worked up, but probably not the best for the transition or the receiving period. Okay? We really would rather hand feed these calves because you get to control at least how much feed is made available to them on a daily basis. The big old Holstein in there may eat 20 pounds, and that little black calf over there may only eat 5, but at least the Holstein couldn't eat 40 and the black calf couldn't eat 40. Okay, so you get to control it. The other thing that that does is it doesn't force you, but it promotes you, maybe it gives you time more on a daily basis to monitor health. And you can catch those sick calves a little bit quicker. Because if I come in there today and I see that they didn't eat half of their feed that I gave them yesterday, that should, ding, 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 something's wrong here. I need to either look at the water, because we talked about the importance of water and intake, or I need to start looking for some sick calves. Okay? So we prefer hand feeding or using a TMR, a total mixed ration, and limit feeding how much we give them to give you an opportunity. The other thing is calves that are really sick, you think they're going to come to the bunk and eat? So if I'm out there and I give them their grain today and I got a calf that doesn't come up, he's probably sick. And I've probably missed him and I better get him in quick. And the other thing is if I got a calf that comes up and I put the feed in and he noses around and he goes back and goes to the water, that's a pretty early telltale sign that he's getting sick or is already on the beginning of getting sick. Because he doesn't want to stand up there with the competition and fight for his feed, and he's going over the water because he's probably running a little bit of a fever and he's trying to get that water to help him from getting dehydrated. Okay? Want palatable feed. When we were in Oklahoma a few years ago on a trip with Becky and others, I thought this backgrounder put it really good. He said, I don't want my cattle to become Hoovers. I don't want to force them to eat everything off of the feed trough. I want them to come in and want to eat. I don't want to force them to clean it all up. And that's true. If you manage your bunks well, you'll have it where they're going to be just a little bit slick, maybe an hour before you come in the next day to feed. Okay? But don't, especially with corn silage or haylage or anything that's been fermented in this weather, and you put it out this morning and it goes through the whole day in 90-degree weather and they didn't eat it all, well, I'm not going to give them any more, I'm going to make them eat it, right? No, because it heats and it spoils. And by the afternoon, really, it's probably spoiled. Okay? So you really want to make sure that you manage the bunks. You want to keep the cattle up on feed. To reduce, during that first 3 weeks or so, to reduce that competition, we recommend 24 inches of bunk space, 2 feet of bunk space. How wide is it from rib cage, one side of the rib cage to the other side of rib cage on a 700-pound calf? If you were to look down him and he's coming at you and he's going to take you and you got to decide either jump the fence or bluff him, how wide is his rib cage? Close to 2 feet, isn't it? Maybe a little bit more. But the point is that we're not down to 12 inches where they're really pushing in there and fighting, right? Okay, we want to give them at least 24 inches so that we reduce that competition. Once they're up on feed and they're doing well through that transition period and they're on the finishing diet, we can back that back down to about 12 inches because they're not all going to come up at the same time and they can rotate through. And then if we move to a self-feeder, we can be down to 4 to 6 inches because they're going to come up at their own leisure and the pecking order is established. Okay? It's also important for calves. We found out for calves that are sourced locally, this doesn't really apply. But if you're finishing cattle and you're moving them a long haul, this is actually data from Texas. There were 4 sources of cattle, and some of these cattle came out of Kentucky. Some of them came out of Oklahoma. I think some of them came out of Arkansas. This is some older classical work that shows that during the first week, okay, these are healthy cattle and these are sick cattle. Okay, this is the first week, the second week, the next 2 weeks, and then the next 4 weeks. Intakes kept on going up, but look, sick calves, about half, about 2/3, and then getting back to normal once the calves start rebounding. So sick calves really don't eat well, do they? So am I going to use a medicated feed to try and treat these sick calves? That's a challenge, isn't it? Because they're really not eating. And so do I put the dosage in there as a shipping fever prevention dosage? Do I put the dosage in there for the treatment of respiratory disease? because that's two different doses. One's 350 milligrams, one's 10 milligrams per pound of body weight for 5 days. All right, makes sense? Treatment of sick cattle through the feed in that first, Dr. Arnold, wouldn't you say this time frame right here is when we're going to see most of our sickness kind of hitting? And who are you going to target? Okay? It's probably better to use out of the bottle to treat sick calves. All right, any questions on that? There were a lot of questions earlier about how we're going to start the cattle on feed. And that's at the kind of the top of the next page or top of the second half if you got the small one. This is just an example of a step-up program. There's two ways of working cattle up. If we have the luxury of having a total mixed ration and we can use 3 or 4 step-up rations or warm-up rations, that's what we'll see a lot of feed yards do. The other thing that most of us would be doing is using one diet, that finishing diet, and just limit feeding how much they get and bringing the grain level up over time. And that's kind of what you have here. Okay? And there's, you know, generally we say 35 to 70% to 75% at most grain in the startup ration. And that's dependent on the risk. Okay? These heavier weight cattle could probably take a little bit more grain, but we're going to keep things pretty safe because we have an end target on the harvest date and we want to make sure that we meet that and we don't have cattle that are going off of feed and causing problems. So if you look at it, we're going to start them generally around 0.75% of body weight on a dry matter basis of grain. And that'll give us about a 45% grain, 55% forage diet because we're also going to give them free choice hay. And then we're going to begin stepping them up. Okay? And the early periods, you can step up pretty fast because there's a lot of hay and protection in there. But then as you get closer to full intakes, you want to increase only 1 pound of grain every 3 to 4 days. Because it takes about 3 to 4 days for cattle to respond to a little bit of acidosis. All right? So this just kind of goes through and gives you a rough idea of how a step-up program using the finishing diet could be done. Okay? My preference is, and that's what we did here, we used a stress feed for about the first 2 weeks. There, I don't remember when these calves came in, but it's probably been about 2 weeks. They just ran out today of that stress feed. Okay? So they had a different ration designed for the first 2 weeks, was medicated with CTC to try and prevent shipping fever, and then they're going to go on to the finishing ration. And then we're going to continue stepping them up on that finishing ration. Okay? Any questions or thoughts as you look through that? All right? Feed additives, we're going to use an ionophore, Rumensin or Bovatec, depending on where we're getting the feeds. But you want to use that for control of coccidiosis and also because it improves feed efficiency. There are other feed additives like your antibiotics that we won't go into much detail. There are the beta-adrenergic agonists, your Optiflex and your Zolpadrol that are usually fed the last 28 to 42 days prior to harvest to try and promote more protein. But all those feed additives must be fed in accordance to the FDA approved combination and at the FDA approved levels. Not even, I mean, most of the feed additives in the near future will also have to come underneath a veterinary prescription. So just be aware that you don't want to make your own concoction and think that you know more than anybody else, and I got a sick calf and so I'm going to mix this and this feed together, because that is a big no-no. All right? And then lastly, there are some general guidelines down there on putting some finishing rations together. And the biggest one to take home is before you start into this, consult with a nutritionist or an extension specialist or somebody that you have confidence in that can get you some background information on developing your good ration.